He thought his twin daughters were gone forever, lost to a tragedy that shattered his world. But 3 years later, on a dusty bus winding through the countryside, he heard their voices singing a moment that would not only break his heart again, but change everything he thought he knew. Where are you watching this story from? Let us know down in the comments. And if you love these kinds of unforgettable tales, don't forget to subscribe and join the family. Now, sit back and experience a story about loss, hope, and a truth more powerful than anyone imagined. They always said the river knew things before the rest of us. Before the wind could carry warnings or the crows could shout their omen cries, the river already rippled with knowledge. That morning, I should have listened to its restless current. I was 12, barefoot and hollow-bellied. The cabin I called home was hardly more than 4 walls leaned into each other with the help of prayer and dry mud. The wood was so thin, you could hear the wind breathing outside, even when there was no breeze. But it was mine. It had been my parents' once, before the sickness came through our little valley like a silent thief, leaving behind graves with no names carved. I lived alone by the creek that ran cold even in July, on land no one wanted, too far from the town and too close to what folks whispered was native territory. They feared the tribes like ghosts in the woods, and I suppose I did too until that morning. I had just dropped the tin pail into the shallows to fetch water when I heard a sound I'll never forget. Not the cry of an animal, nor the wind twisting through reeds. It was human, desperate and sharp, and it cut through the quiet like a knife. I froze. My hands gripped the handle of the bucket tighter than I meant to. The sound came again closer, more ragged. I turned toward the source and squinted across the gray ribbon of creek water. The mist hung heavy that morning, rising in fingers from the surface like the land itself was trying to hold onto its secrets. That's when I saw her. She was on the far bank, half hidden in the tall grass, a mess of dark hair and blood. Her leg lay twisted beneath her in a way that made my stomach knot. Even from a distance, I could see the pain in her face, etched so deep it looked carved into her bones. I didn't know her. I didn't know her people. But I knew one thing. No one was going to find her out there, not in time, and if I turned my back, she would die. I didn't even think. That's the part I still wonder about, sometimes. Why didn't I think? Maybe because if I had, I would have talked myself out of it. I kicked off my boots, tossed the empty pail behind me, and stepped into the water. The creek wasn't wide, but the rains had swelled it. The current caught at my knees and pulled like angry fingers, and the cold bit into my skin until I couldn't feel my toes. Each step forward felt like it took twice as much strength as the last. The moss-covered rocks below threatened to betray my footing. One wrong step, and I would have joined her on the riverbank, broken, helpless. She watched me with wide, unreadable eyes. Her lips moved, but I couldn't hear anything above the water's rush. Her hand reached toward me, not to plead, but steady like she was already preparing to help me help her. By the time I reached her, my limbs trembled from more than just the cold. I knelt beside her, unsure of what to do next. Her leg was bad. Bad enough that I had to look away before I could steady myself again. She gritted her teeth as I slid my arm around her shoulders. She was maybe a year younger than me, but lighter, as if the pain had drained her weight. The trip back across the creek was harder. Carrying her meant the water rose to my chest. My dress dragged me down like a net, and more than once the current spun me sideways, nearly toppling us both. But she held on. I don't know how. I think now that she was braver than I was, even then. We made it. Just barely. I collapsed on the far bank, gasping for breath, our bodies slick with mud and water and blood. She didn't cry. She never did. Not once. Not even as I splinted her leg later with 2 sticks and some old twine. I dragged her back to my cabin, one arm slung over my shoulders, her weight sagging against me with each step. Inside, the fire was long out, and the place smelled of damp wood and old smoke. I laid her down on the floor near the hearth and covered her with my blanket. It was the only one I had. For hours, I moved like a ghost, boiling water, tearing up my only spare dress for bandages, trying to remember the things my mother used to do when I got scraped or sick. She never said a word, just watched me with those dark, intelligent eyes. Every so often she'd wince or breathe a little harder, and I'd pause, but she never asked me to stop. She must have been from one of the nearby tribes. I could see it in the beadwork on what was left of her clothes, in the style of her braids, half undone now but still neatly parted. Her boots were well made, better than anything I'd ever owned. Someone had loved her. Someone was probably looking for her. But I didn't ask. I didn't know the words, and she didn't know mine. That night, she fell into a restless sleep by the fire, her leg raised and bound as best as I could manage. I stayed awake, listening to the creak, to the wind, to the too loud silence. I watched the girl's chest rise and fall and wondered if I had done the right thing, if I had made things worse. If the folks in town found out, they'd call it foolish, maybe even dangerous. They'd say I had no business helping her, that I was putting myself in harm's way. But as I watched her stir, muttering soft syllables in a language I didn't know, I felt something shift in the air, like the land was holding its breath. And I think now it was. Because somewhere out there, someone had noticed her missing, and they weren't just looking, they were coming. I didn't know it then, but saving her hadn't just changed her fate. It had changed mine, too. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I tried. I lay there on the floor a few feet from the fire, wrapped in the thin quilt my mother had sewn before her hands grew too tired to hold a needle. I'd pulled it up to my chin, eyes fixed on the flickering shadows that danced across the log walls. But sleep never came, not with the weight of the girl's breath behind me, shallow and uneven, nor with the feeling that the woods outside had grown strangely alert, as if listening for something I couldn't hear. The air was heavy. Not just with the coming dawn, but with the thick kind of stillness that comes before something breaks. I sat up some time before morning, the fire reduced to glowing coals. I moved quietly to check her leg. It had swollen more during the night, and the cloth I'd tied around it was soaked through with blood and creek water. She stirred under the blanket, her brow glistening with sweat, but she didn't wake. I knew she needed better help than I could give. The closest town was 3 miles downriver, but they wouldn't welcome her. Not in these times. Ever since Old Man Colors was found dead near his pasture arrow in his chest, they said the townsfolk had been on edge, blaming every rustling leaf on the savages. It didn't matter that Colors had been a mean drunk who once tried to sell 2 kids to a fur trader. All they remembered was the arrow. So I didn't saddle the mule or pack a bag to ride into town for help. Instead, I took the battered hunting knife from the shelf, slid it into my boot, and stepped outside. The dawn was gray and damp. Mist still clung to the tall grass and drifted between the trees like half-formed ghosts. I knelt at the riverbank, washing my hands in the icy water, trying to think. If I couldn't go to town, and she couldn't walk, what then? The answer came not in words, but in instinct. I didn't need to go anywhere. They were coming to me. It started with the birds. Just after sunup, the usual songbirds that crowded the branches above my cabin went silent all at once. Not gradually, but like someone had blown out the sound like a candle. The stillness that followed was absolute. Then, the wind changed. It carried something strange smoke, yes, but not from pine or hearth. It smelled faintly sweet, like burning cedar and animal hide. The kind of fire that meant ceremony, not cooking. I stood in the doorway of the cabin, heart thudding. Then I heard the drums. They were faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the beat of my own heart. But they grew louder, steadier, as if the earth itself was answering them. They didn't come from one direction, but many. From the trees beyond the creek, from the hill to the west, even from beyond the ridge where the sun was just beginning to crest. I rushed back inside. The girl was awake now, sitting up against the wall with her injured leg stretched before her. Her face had gone pale as birch bark. She was clutching something, a small strip of cloth she must have torn from her own clothing. Her hands moved with purpose, trembling but focused, threading something through the fabric. She looked up at me when I entered and said something in her language, soft, rhythmic. She didn't sound afraid. Not exactly. More like resigned. I wanted to ask her what was happening, who was coming, but even without words, I knew she was never lost. She had been missed. By the time the first shapes appeared on the horizon, the drums had become a living thing echoing off the trees, rising and falling like waves. I stood at the edge of the cabin, eyes squinting toward the tree line. The mist parted, and they came. First, the horses painted in colors that matched the earth and sky, with feathers braided into their manes. Then the riders, tall, silent figures in leathers and furs, their faces marked with paint that seemed to shimmer in the rising light. Not just warriors, elders, scouts, women with bows strapped to their backs. And more. Dozens, then hundreds. I counted only to 50 before I gave up. They moved like water, flowing through the field toward my cabin in perfect silence, the drums still pulsing behind them like a heartbeat from the hills. In the center of the riders came a man unlike any I'd ever seen. He rode a white stallion with a black handprint painted across its flank. His chest was bare despite the chill, marked with symbols I didn't understand, and a necklace of carved bone hung low across his chest. His eyes were like the stillness of the creek before a flood. I didn't need to be told who he was. This was the father, her father, chief of his people, and judging by the reverence with which the others moved around him, something more than a man, a symbol, a mountain that had learned to walk. He didn't raise a weapon. He didn't shout. He simply brought his horse to a stop 20 feet from my cabin and stared. Behind me, the girl tried to rise. I turned instinctively to help, but she held up a hand, shaky but firm. She wanted to do it herself. Her leg was trembling as she put weight on it, using the wall for support. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and her breath came fast, but she made it to the door on her own. She stood beside me, eyes locked with the man on the white horse. Then, slowly, she raised the cloth she had been stitching all night. From this distance, I could finally see it clearly. A symbol sewn in rough, hurried thread, a circle, with two lines intersecting at the center. Simple, but unmistakably deliberate. She held it high, as if it were a flag, or a message only he would understand. The man's expression changed. I couldn't say how I didn't know his face well enough, but something passed through his eyes. Recognition, relief, and then something else, grief, maybe, or fury. Without a word, he dismounted. Others did the same, and within moments the clearing around my cabin was filled with men and women on foot, their eyes shifting between me and the girl. Weapons remained sheathed, hands remained still, but the tension in the air was thicker than anything I'd ever felt. He approached. I stood frozen. I was taller than the girl by only an inch or two, and yet, standing next to this man, I felt impossibly small. His shadow fell across me as he stopped before the threshold. His eyes moved from his daughter, her bandaged leg, her pale face, then to me. He spoke. The words were deep and low and came from somewhere in his chest. I didn't understand them, but the tone didn't hold accusation, only weight. Then, slowly, he turned and raised his arms. A signal. The warriors parted. Out from the crowd came two older men carrying bundles. One held food wrapped and tied with care. The other held something larger, a blanket of sorts, woven with colors I'd never seen, threaded with beads that shimmered like dew. The chief took it and stepped forward. He didn't offer it like a gift. He wrapped it around my shoulders. I didn't move, couldn't speak. The cloth was warm from being held, heavy with meaning I didn't yet understand. Then the others began to approach, one by one, each bringing something, a carved bowl, a feather, a woven necklace. They weren't just gifts, they were acknowledgments, as if I had stepped into a role I hadn't asked for, and they were dressing me for it. I didn't understand what was happening, not fully. But I knew one thing. This wasn't a warning. It was a welcome. A storm had arrived at my door, not to destroy, but to change. I don't remember how long I stood there wrapped in that blanket. The world had gone strangely quiet, like the woods were holding their breath. The drumbeats had stopped, and in their absence, I became acutely aware of every crackle of grass, every rustle of fabric, every shifting bootstep on the damp soil. No one touched me. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The gesture had spoken loud enough. This wasn't just a thank you. It was something else. Something older. Adoption. I'd heard whispers of such things in stories told around fireplace embers, the kind of tales folks told when the wind howled and the moon was hidden. Stories about tribes taking in outsiders, war orphans, lost travelers, even the children of enemies, binding them into the tribe through ceremony and blood. It wasn't done lightly, and yet here I was, a girl with no family, no place to belong, now standing in the center of a gathering that felt bigger than the valley itself, wrapped in cloth that had held the scent of cedar smoke and river stone and horsehair. The girl, the one I had pulled from the river, was being lifted now. Two women, both younger than the chief but bearing the same quiet strength, carried her between them. Her injured leg dangled uselessly, but she didn't cry out. She hadn't made a sound since the arrival of her people. As they walked past me, she met my eyes and smiled. It was a small thing, crooked and tired, but it was real. That smile changed something inside me. Like a thaw after years of winter. They took her away, deeper into the woods where I could see tents rising from the earth like mushrooms after a storm, leather and hide, painted with animal forms, lined in bone. A village had been summoned overnight, and I had no choice but to follow. They didn't speak my language, not directly, but they didn't leave me behind either. A boy not much older than me, maybe 15, took my mule by the reins and led it toward a makeshift corral beyond the tree line. He gave me a nod. I nodded back. That was enough. I was guided to a large tent, smoke curling from its peak, the flap open as if waiting for me. Inside, the smell was strong herbs, drying meat, burning sage. A woman with lines etched deep into her face and hair braided with feathers gestured for me to sit on a woven mat. She pressed her hand to my shoulder, then offered me a wooden bowl. The stew inside was unlike anything I'd tasted, rich, smoky, earthy. I ate it all. After, they brought water. Then a new blanket. Then silence. Time moved differently among them. It didn't march, it drifted. Hours passed without anyone rushing. Conversations were short, words few. Everything had purpose. Everyone moved like they belonged to something greater. Like the air itself was thick with memory and ritual. No one asked me questions. No one needed to. They knew who I was now. The girl who had carried one of their own from the river, who had wrapped her in warmth and stopped the bleeding. I didn't know if it made me brave or foolish. I only knew it had made me part of their story. Night fell again. The stars above the clearing burned so bright it felt like the sky had cracked open. I lay beneath a woven canopy, wrapped in the ceremonial blanket, listening to distant singing, low, rhythmic, ancient. Not joyful exactly, but full of reverence. A song meant for ancestors, and perhaps for me. On the second day, they led me to her. The injured girl, still silent, still pale, was resting in a small tent by the river. Her leg had been carefully splinted, wrapped in tight, herbal-soaked linens. A carved amulet hung from the top of the tent, swaying in the breeze. She was awake, and waiting. I sat beside her, awkward and unsure. Then, slowly, she reached out her fingers wrapped around mine. She pressed something into my palm, a bead, small blue-green, shaped like a drop of water. I stared at it. She tapped her chest, then mine, then smiled again. I wore it around my neck after that. A string was found, and the bead was tied close to my throat. I didn't know what it meant yet, but I knew enough not to take it off. The next morning, things changed. Drums returned. Not the slow, steady ones from before, but faster, louder, rhythmic with purpose. Men began to paint their faces, women dressed in feathers and bone. A fire was lit at the center of the village, so large its smoke columned straight into the sky like a beacon. A ceremony was coming. I had no idea what kind, but I knew I was at the center of it. They washed me with river water. My hands, my face, my feet. Then they dressed me not in my own worn clothes, but in something stitched from leather and fur, adorned with symbols I didn't understand. Circles, hands, animals. They painted my cheeks with a red line that ran from the corners of my eyes to my jaw. I didn't recognize myself. And yet, I did. At dusk, the entire village gathered. Hundreds now. More than I'd thought possible. Warriors on horseback, elders seated in a wide circle, children with wide eyes holding small drums and rattles. The fire at the center roared like it had a voice of its own. I was led to the middle. The chief stood across from me, now cloaked in a robe of feathers that shimmered like a raven's wing. His eyes were painted black, but they softened when he looked at me. He raised both hands. The drums stopped. Then he began to speak. I didn't understand his words, but I understood their shape, the way he moved, the way the others responded. He was telling a story. About the girl in the river, about the stranger who found her, about how blood can call across distance, and how the land remembers kindness. When he finished, he pulled a knife from his belt. My breath caught. He didn't come toward me. He turned to the fire. With careful precision, he pricked his thumb just enough to draw a bead of red. Then he extended it toward the flames. A moment passed. Then one by one, others stepped forward. They did the same. Not a wound, just a drop, a symbol. When the girl I had rescued finally rose, limping and pale, and came to stand beside me, she too offered her thumb to the fire. The chief turned to me, held out the knife. He didn't move. Not at first. But then I remembered that cold river water, her limp body, the blood on my hands. I took the knife, pressed the edge to my skin. The flame sizzled when it hit the blood, and just like that, I was one of them. But as the night deepened and the fire grew hotter, I noticed something else, something darker. Among the faces that surrounded us, not all were smiling. A few, 3, maybe 4, stood apart. Older warriors, silent and still, their eyes sharp and cold. One of them never took his eyes off me, not during the fire, not during the songs. Not even when the girl leaned against me with her hand in mine. I saw something in those eyes I hadn't seen in the others. Doubt, distrust, and maybe something worse. The fire couldn't melt all hearts, and I had just been accepted into a tribe where not all wolves had left the forest. It took me a long time to sleep after the ceremony. Even after the fire burned low and the chants turned into humming and the humming gave way to silence, I lay on the woven mats staring up at the tent ceiling, watching the smoke drift out the top like a spirit escaping the night. The warmth of the blood ceremony still clung to my skin. So did the weight of a few eyes that had never looked away. There were 3 of them older warriors, each with weathered faces like tree bark and long braids hung with claws and beads. They hadn't joined the chanting. They hadn't touched the fire. One had even left before the girl touched her blood to the flame. They didn't speak to me, but I felt them. They didn't believe I belonged here, and something told me they never would. Life in the village followed no clock, no bells, no ticking hands. Just the sun, the wind, and the whisper of trees. Each morning, the smell of smoke and herbs drifted in through the tent flaps before I even opened my eyes. Women stirred pots over fires. Children chased one another between the tents. Dogs padded silently underfoot, never barking. It should have felt strange. It didn't. I began to help. At first clumsy and unsure, carrying water, grinding dried roots, shaking off sleep as I tried to copy their motions. But no one mocked me. They only watched, nodded, and showed me again. The girl whose name I learned was Tama recovered faster than anyone expected. By the end of the week, she was walking again, leaning on a carved cane and my shoulder. She didn't speak much, but when she did, it was soft and melodic. Her voice had the rhythm of the river. She taught me words, names for trees, for stars, for fire, for sister. One night, she painted a mark on my arm with red clay, a line with 3 dots above it. I asked what it meant. She touched my heart, then hers, then the sky. He didn't ask again. I had never known consistency before. Not like this. Not the kind of safety that hummed quietly, without demand. I'd grown up clutching scraps, leftovers, cast-offs, moments stolen from kindness before the wind changed. But now there was rhythm. Now there was a seat at the fire. Now there were eyes that searched for mine when laughter broke the silence. And there were songs low, wordless lullabies the women sang as they combed through Tama's hair, and eventually mine. Songs that wrapped around your bones and told you, without needing to say it, you're not alone anymore. But it wasn't perfect. Because the men who never sang still watched. Their names came to me in fragments. Gray Tooth, the one with a deep scar across his cheek. Hawk Without Cry, whose silence felt like thunder. And the third one, no one named. The oldest of them. Wrinkled as river stone with cloudy eyes that still saw too much. He carved bones by the fire, his hands always moving, never shaking. He never looked directly at me, but I knew he was always aware. They weren't unkind, just distant, unmovable, like boulders that refused to shift no matter how many seasons passed. Whenever I passed too close, the air stiffened. Tama said little about them. Only once did she warn me. She pointed toward their corner of the village and whispered, "Blood remembers." Then she tapped her chest to my chest and turned away. I started to dream. Strange, vivid dreams that woke me before dawn. In them, I was standing in the middle of the river, the water running red. Tama was on the bank, calling to me, but her mouth made no sound. Behind her, a great shadow moved between the tree's antlers. Teeth. Smoke. I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't wake. I told no one. But every morning, the bead she gave me felt heavier around my neck. One evening, I was invited on a hunt. Not to chase, just to follow. To learn. 10 riders. All younger warriors. They painted their faces with ash and charcoal, carried bows and spears that gleamed in the setting sun. Tama convinced them to bring me. She said I needed to see more than the firelight and herb tents. The woods were vast, deeper than I ever knew. Pines that kissed the clouds, rocks shaped like beasts, paths worn by elk and bear and time itself. We followed a trail for hours, speaking in hushed tones. The lead hunter, Kitsu, sharp-eyed and gentle, pointed out claw marks on bark, scat trails, tufts of fur caught on thorns. I followed like a shadow, quiet, alert. Then we found the remains. Not animal. Something else. Cloth, torn leather, a broken saddle, bones picked clean, buried beneath a pile of stones that had been disturbed. Kitsu nelpesiteit. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he said a single word I didn't understand. The others stiffened. And in the silence, I realized this was no animal kill. This had been a man. Back at the village, the drums didn't sound that night. Fires burned lower. People spoke less. Something had returned with us. Something more than bone and memory. A whisper. A warning. Even Tama's voice quieted. When I asked her what it meant, she only said, "Not all ghosts wear white." That night, I couldn't sleep. I left my tent and wandered the edge of the village, past the horses, past the canoes, past the place where the trees grew thick and the moon barely reached. And there near the stones that marked the edge of their sacred ground, I saw him, the nameless elder. He sat cross-legged beside a small fire, carving something into a long piece of bone. He didn't look up. Didn't stop, just spoke without turning. Blood sings loud, but sometimes it lies. I froze. He held up the bone, half-finished, and ran his thumb across the edge. Some spirits come wrapped in kindness, but they carry storms. I didn't understand, but they didn't forget. In the days that followed, the village began to change. More warriors arrived from deeper parts of the forest. Cousins, uncles, distant kin. The old camp grew. New fires, new songs, but always that undercurrent of tension, like a river rising just beneath the soil. They were preparing for something. I didn't know what. Tama wouldn't say, but one night, as we sat watching the stars blink awake, she touched the bead at my neck and whispered, "Soon, you'll have to choose." I looked at her, confused. Choose what? She didn't answer. She only rested her head on my shoulder, and in the distance, the old men watched the sky like it was about to fall. I don't remember hearing the first shot, only the silence afterward. One moment, Tama and I were collecting herbs near the southern tree line. The next, the birds were gone. The air grew still. The wind stopped breathing. And then, a howl. Not from a wolf, from a man. Sharp, pain-filled, cut off too quickly. I dropped the basket and stood. Tama already had her knife in her hand. The smoke rose fast, dark, curling into the clouds like fingers. And from that smoke came riders, 5 of them strangers, coated in dust and rage. Their faces were pale, mouths twisted into snarls, guns drawn, coats flapping like broken wings. They didn't call out, didn't warn, they just fired. The village burst like a struck drum. Women screamed. Children fled into the trees. Warriors scrambled for their weapons. Tama grabbed my wrist and ran, dragging me behind a storage tent. From there, I saw everything. One of the men leapt from his horse and kicked over a pot of herbs, his boots crushing the fire underneath. Another tore open a woven tent and dragged out a man by the hair, an elder, his eyes wide with disbelief. The third raised his rifle and I turned away. Tama's grip tightened. We had no time to mourn, no time to think, only move. They were looking for something. That much became clear. They weren't looting. They weren't chasing. They were hunting. And not animals. They were organized, intentional, as if they'd been here before, or had been told exactly where to go. It didn't last long. The warriors fought like shadows appearing from behind rocks, vanishing into smoke, reappearing on rooftops. I watched one leap from a tree and bring down a man twice his size with nothing but a blade and a roar. The invaders weren't prepared for that. They came thinking they'd crush something soft. Instead, they met teeth. By sundown, 2 of the riders were dead. The other 3 were gone, fled into the forest, bleeding and afraid. But the village wasn't whole. Not anymore. 5 dead. 2 wounded. 1 child missing. And a message burned into the soil. They would be back. That night, the council gathered. All of them, the chief, the elders, the quiet warriors. Even the 3 who never sang. They sat around the central fire, speaking in low voices. Not arguing, just planning. Like people who'd fought too many wars to waste time on fear. Tama and I watched from the edge of the light. Eventually, the nameless elder looked up right at me. And for the first time since I arrived, he spoke my name. Emmy. It felt heavy, like a gavel hitting stone. He stood, slowly, and approached. Then, with the fire painting his face in flickering gold, he asked, "Do you remember your father's name?" He blinked. "What?" He said nothing else. Only waited. My voice cracked when I answered. He never knew it. That wasn't entirely true. There was a name on a paper, somewhere, long ago, but I couldn't recall the letters. Only that they were smeared with tears and coffee and time. The elder studied me. Then he pulled something from his pouch. A shard of metal, rusty, flat, about the size of a coin. He handed it to me. The shape was unfamiliar, but the emblem? A star. A U.S. Marshal badge. My heart dropped into my stomach. "Where did you get this?" The elder didn't reply. Instead, another voice, deeper, angrier, cut in. "They followed her," growled Greytooth. He stood, pointing a shaking finger. First, the wounded girl. Now, the girl with no blood. The fire spirits warned us. She brings smoke. Tama stepped forward, eyes flashing. "She saved me," she said firmly. She saved many. But the old man wasn't listening. Others began to murmur. Some nodded. Others stayed silent. I looked at the badge again, felt its weight. The steel felt warm, too warm, like it remembered something I didn't. That night, Tama told me a story. We sat beside the river, knees in the mud, watching the current drag branches downstream. She spoke slowly, carefully. Many years ago, before I was born, your people came here. I didn't interrupt. They came with weapons and maps and flags. Said they wanted peace. Said they wanted land. She touched the water. They took more than land. I looked away. She leaned closer. One man wore a star, like this. She touched the badge still clutched in my hand. He smiled, learned our names, spoke our words, then burned 4 villages while we slept. My stomach turned. I'm not him. Tama nodded. I know, but others won't. I didn't sleep that night. Didn't even lie down. I sat by the fire, watching the smoke drift upward, and wondered, who was I? Not just my name, not just my face, but my blood. My shadow? What ghosts followed me? And why did the invaders know where to find us? The next morning, I searched through the charred remains of the invaders' camp. One of them had dropped a journal, burned on one side, still legible on the other. Inside, sketches, notes, directions, and one name underlined twice. Emmeline Wren, my full name, a name I never told anyone. When I brought the journal to the chief, he didn't speak. He only passed it to the elders, one by one. Then he looked at me and said, your enemies carry your name in their teeth. Now we must decide what to do with you. The words struck like arrows. I looked to Tama. She stared at the ground. Greytooth was already speaking again. Angry, certain. He wanted me gone. But then the chief raised his hand. Silence returned. And the nameless elder stood. Let her prove her path, he said simply. Then he turned to me. Go to the mountain. Alone. Find the stone that sings. Return before the moon bleeds. Or do not return at all. It was not a request. They gave me no food, no water. Only a knife and a direction. Tama hugged me, trembling. She pressed something into my palm. A dried sprig of ghost, sage a plant I'd seen her hang above the tents. Protection. I wanted to cry. He didn't. There wasn't time. The forest swallowed me. The air grew colder. The shadows deeper. The birds didn't sing. I followed the path north, past the river, past the scarred trees, past the broken stones that marked old graves. And eventually, I reached the mountain. It wasn't tall, but it was silent. Too silent. And at the top, a cave. Inside, darkness, and the sound of wind or breath. I stepped forward, knife drawn. And then, a voice. Not Tama, not Mine, not human. So, you have returned. I stood at the mouth of the cave. Cold air poured from it, like breath from an old, tired animal. The wind carried no bird song, no rustling leaves, no distant hooves. Only the faint sound of something pulsing, almost like a heartbeat beneath the earth. And the voice, that ancient, breathless whisper that didn't echo but bled. So, you have returned. I should have run, but he didn't. I stepped forward. The cave swallowed the light behind me. Within a few paces, I could no longer see the sky. Only stone, wet, cold, breathing. The walls pulsed faintly with veins of quartz and copper, glinting like dying embers. My footsteps echoed strangely not as single sounds, but like ripples, bouncing back out of rhythm. And then the voice again. You carry the name of the one who tore the valley, but your blood is not yet poison. I gripped my knife tighter. Who are you? No answer. Instead, a shift in the dark ahead like something massive unfolding itself. I moved closer, and there it was. A figure. Seated. Still. Its form was cloaked in strands of moss and bone, feathers braided into hair longer than any river I'd known. Its eyes were closed, yet it saw. Not with vision, but with memory. A shaman. Or something older. Not man. Not beast. A spirit caught between lifetimes. When it finally opened its mouth, I felt the air shift in my lungs. Your father wore a star and buried his name beneath your cradle. My heart stopped. Who was he? The spirit tilted its head. The hunter who became the hunted. The thief who tried to return what he had stolen. He left you in the hands of wolves, believing they had learned to love. My legs weakened. I dropped to my knees. I don't remember any of it. The spirit leaned closer. Its breath smelled of pine smoke and old rot. Because you were made to forget. It raised one arm and touched my forehead. Images exploded behind my eyes. Flashes. A cabin. My mother's scream. A man in a coat with a badge shouting, holding me, then running as gunfire chased him. Blood. Then darkness. Then a woman's voice soft, whispering lullabies in a language I didn't know. Another fire. Another scream. Then the cabin again, burned to the ground. Me alone in the frost. A church bell in the distance. I stumbled back, gasping. What does it mean? The spirit turned away. Your name is a map. Your memory, the lock. But your choices are the key. The cave began to rumble. Go now. The moon bleeds soon, and death rides behind you. Then silence. The spirit was gone. Outside, dusk bled across the sky. The first star blinked awake. I descended the mountain slowly, knees trembling. Halfway down, I spotted the tracks. Fresh. Boot prints. Not Motstasens. Not from the tribe, but hard, wide, deep. 5 men. Armed, headed toward the village. I ran. Branches tore at my arms. Roots tried to trip me. But he didn't stop. I reached the river by midnight. And what I saw turned my blood to glass. Smoke, again, and torches, flickering in the trees like angry eyes. But no scream, no sound. Too quiet, too wrong. I crept closer and found the village empty, not destroyed, not looted. Yes, gone. Tents stood untouched. Fires still smoldered. Food still boiled in pots. But not a soul remained. It was as if they had all stepped out of the world at once. Then I saw the markings. Painted in ash. On the ground, in a perfect circle. A symbol I'd never seen before but somehow felt. A spiral inside a handprint. The same mark I saw in the spirit's eyes. At the center of the circle, my basket. The one I dropped days ago. And next to it, a feather. Not from Tama's headdress, but from the spirit's hair. I reached down. As my fingers touched it, the wind screamed. The world spun. Suddenly, I wasn't in the village anymore. I was in the forest again. Alone. Except a figurestutheit. Small. Thin. A child. Face hidden in shadow. I called out. She didn't move. I stepped forward. And then I saw her face. Mine, but younger. Eyes wide. Skin pale. Lips trembling. She raised a hand and pointed behind me. I turned. And there, standing among the trees, were them. The 5 men. Pale. Hollow. Wearing no expressions. Just hunger. They raised their rifles. And fired. But the bullets didn't hit. They passed through me. I turned back. The child version of me was gone, and the woods were burning. I heard screams, familiar voices. Tama, the chief, Gray Tooth, all calling my name. Then silence again. I woke up on the riverbank, soaked, shivering, the village still empty. But the symbol was gone. Only my basket remained. And the badge, now blackened, melted slightly at the edge, almost like it had been near fire or judgment. I walked back toward the central fire pit, heart pounding. And there, beside the stone seat where the elders once gathered, I found a single mark scratched into the dirt. 1 moon left. No name. No signature. Just the warning. The next morning, I found Tama. Or rather, she found me. She stepped from the trees like she'd never left. But her face was older, changed. She didn't explain where the others were, only whispered, "You must choose soon." "Choose what?" Tama touched my chest. "Whether your blood leads you to peace or fire." That night I stared into the flames, holding the blackened badge in one hand and the feather in the other. And for the first time, I felt something split inside me. A seam, long sealed, starting to crack. Not pain, not fear, but something deeper. Like destiny waking up in my bones. I didn't know what I was becoming, but I knew I wasn't alone anymore. And when the moon bled, I would be ready. At dawn, the wind changed. Not just in direction, but in weight. It carried something bitter, like iron and ash. And far behind the scent, I could smell blood. Not fresh, but old, lingering, like a warning that the earth itself didn't want to whisper aloud. I followed it. Not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't not. Tama walked behind me. She said nothing. She hadn't spoken much since we left the circle. Her eyes were darker now, like storm clouds thick with thunder. Sometimes she would stop suddenly and tilt her head as if listening to something no one else could hear. Then she'd nod once and keep walking. I didn't ask who spoke to her, because deep down, I already knew. We climbed the eastern ridge. It took us until dusk. From the top, the valley opened before us like a wounded animal. Smoke curled in soft spirals above the tree line. Not from fires, from torches. Dozens of them, marching, men, armed, white men, with rifles, horses, wagons, and cages. I couldn't breathe. Tama spoke. They didn't come to fight. They came to harvest. We followed them from a distance, down through the wooded hollows, past streams that once ran clean but now smelled of black powder and urine. At night, we heard laughter, rough, broken laughter. The kind that comes from men who know no one is watching. The kind that doesn't come from joy, but from ownership. They had the tribe, bound, shackled, split into 3 groups. Old, strong, young. I saw Gray Tooth, his beard bloodied, his head bowed. The chief was missing. Tama's hands trembled as she gripped a blade. They took them for something more than land, I whispered. Tama didn't answer, but the hate in her eyes was answer enough. We waited until nightfall. Then we crept closer, one tent at a time. The guards were lazy, drunk. They weren't expecting shadows, much less children. We cut the bonds of 6 captives, told them to run north, follow the birch trees, never look back. They obeyed, but I knew we couldn't save all. Not tonight. So I watched. I memorized faces. There was a man in a long coat, black wide-brimmed hat, pale scar down his cheek. He barked orders. The others obeyed, even the ones twice his size. And beside him stood a boy, no older than me, eyes like coal. No joy, no fear, just emptiness and a star-shaped badge on his chest. My blood froze. It was the same badge as my father's, only unburned, untarnished. The boy looked straight at me, even from across the fire. Didn't blink, didn't flinch. Like he knew who I was, like he was waiting. Back on the ridge, Tama finally spoke. That boy, he doesn't belong to them, but he's bound to them, as you were meant to be. I turned. What do you mean? She looked away. Your father. He made a deal. But deals made in fear grow teeth. Now that boy carries your half of the weight. Here's what you could have become. And you are what he was denied. I stared into the fire below. The men danced. The boy did not. He just watched. Not just the flames, but me, like he was waiting for me to choose. Tama touched my arm. 1 night left. Then they move east, into the sacred grounds. Once they cross, we cannot stop what wakes. I didn't understand. Not fully, but I knew one thing. We couldn't wait anymore. We returned to the old cave. I needed answers. I needed strength. I needed something more than rage. The spirit was gone, but the stone it had sat on remained, carved with the same spiral hand symbol. I placed my palm over it. Nothing happened. At first. Then, pain. Like my bones were unraveling. Like my blood was being stirred by invisible hands. I saw flashes again, but not from my own life. From the boys. They had no name, only a number. 12. Raised in a fort with white walls and no sky. Taught to shoot before he could speak. Whipped for speaking anything other than English. They burned his hair, erased his language, fed him war stories, taught him that fear was weakness, that silence was strength, and they gave him the badge the day they made him kill. When I woke, my hands were shaking, but he felt clear, as if someone had cleaned the windows of my soul. Tama looked at me. You saw him? I nodded. She smiled sadly. Then you know now. He doesn't need punishment. He needs release. I nodded again, and for the first time, I felt no fear about what came next. We gathered what we could. 2 spears, a pouch of dust from the sacred cedar, a horn carved by the elder years ago, and the stone, the one from the cave. It pulsed now when I held it, like a heart, like it knew its time had come. We approached the enemy camp one last time. The stars above blinked silently, witnesses. And as I crouched in the tall grass, waiting for the moment to act, the boy stepped out of the shadows. Alone, unarmed, he looked at me, and slowly took off the badge. He dropped it into the fire. Then he spoke. I dreamed of you. You were holding the sun, but it was bleeding. I didn't answer. He walked forward, stopped 3 paces away, and said, if you kill me, I'll be free. If you spare me, I'll become what they made me to be. So choose. My hand trembled on the hilt, not from doubt, but from something deeper. I realized then he wasn't asking for mercy. He was asking me to finish what the world started. But I didn't raise the blade. Instead, I raised the stone, held it between us, let it glow. Soft, white, ancient. It pulsed once, then again. And when it pulsed a 3rd time, the boy fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. Not from pain, from remembrance. He whispered, my name was Nico. Then he closed his eyes. And somewhere in the distance, the drums began to beat again. The tribe was coming back, not in chains, but in fire. The morning arrived like a breath held too long, tense, electric, and full of unspoken promises. I woke to the faint rumble of distant drums, deeper than before. Not just a beat, but a calling, a summons that reached beyond our valley, beyond the ridge, beyond the forests and rivers. This was the sound of awakening. Nico sat beside me, silent, but no longer broken. His eyes held a flicker of something new, a fragile hope, a tentative bond. He no longer carried the weight of chains and badges, but the first flicker of something free. The tribe was returning, but this time, they were not the defeated. They were the storm gathering on the horizon. We met at the edge of the valley. Chief Takakota stood with the warriors, faces painted with the colors of battle and rebirth. The air was thick with the scent of cedar and smoke. His eyes found mine, and in that look I understood. This was not just a reunion, it was a reckoning. Nico stepped forward. The warriors tensed. Some whispered in shock. How could the boy raised by enemies stand with the tribe now? How could he carry their hopes and fears so openly? But the chief nodded, slow and sure. He is the bridge, he said through Tama's voice. I saw then what they all saw, a boy once broken, now a living symbol of what was possible when old wounds were faced, not hidden. I felt it too, in my bones. The creek that once divided us was no longer a boundary. It was a lifeline. We spent the day preparing. The warriors sharpened their spears and bows. The elders whispered blessings. And I learned more about Nico's world, its harshness, its cold laws, its silence. He learned about ours, the wilds, the creek, the old stories that even the oldest warriors still told. That night, around the fire, the air thick with smoke and stories, the chief spoke directly to me. He told me of the prophecy the one whispered long before my time that spoke of a pale child who would walk between worlds, whose heart would call the thunder, and whose courage would bind the broken. I realized then that my rescue of Ayana was only the beginning, that the threads of fate had woven me into something far larger. The next morning, the air was charged with electricity. Word had spread of the boy who had cast off his chains, and the girl who had stood by him. Men from the neighboring forts, the settlers, the traders, they all watched from the shadows. Some with curiosity, some with fear, but all waiting. We rode at dawn. 500 warriors, strong and proud, with Nico and me at their side. The path was long and treacherous, but the fire in our hearts burned brighter than any obstacle. As we approached the fort where Nico had been held, I felt my hands tighten around the reins. This was more than a battle. It was a reclaiming. The walls were high and cold, but the warriors did not hesitate. They moved as one, a force of nature, striking with precision and purpose. The fight was fierce, not just for land or power, but for identity, for family, for the right to be seen. When the dust settled, the fort was ours. The prisoners were freed, and the boy named Nico was no longer a shadow in the night. The victory was more than physical. It was spiritual. That night, under a sky full of stars, Chief Takakota declared a new beginning, a treaty not just of land, but of hearts. I stood beside him, feeling the weight of my journey, from orphan to daughter, from stranger to sister, from fear to fierce. The creek that once divided our worlds now flowed between us, carrying the stories of pain, courage, and hope. And as the drums echoed once more, I knew this was just the start. For in every ending, there is a new song waiting to be sung. The days after the victory felt surreal. Our lives, once so fragile, so uncertain, had found new meaning in the blazing heart of the tribe's camp. I no longer felt like the orphan by the creek. I was becoming something more, something unbreakable. The tribe had welcomed me as their own. The gifts from Chief Takakota's people, the warm robes, the tools, the food, were not just symbols. They were promises. Promises of belonging, safety, and future. But what touched me most was the unspoken bond I now shared with Nico and Ayana, a trio forged in struggle, hope, and change. Ayana's leg was healing, and with it, her spirit shone brighter than ever. She was no longer just a chief's daughter. She was a warrior of peace, a living bridge between the old world and the new. Watching her move through the camp with quiet grace, I knew that together we would carry this fragile peace forward. But peace was never simple. Whispers drifted through the camp like smoke stories of settlers and traders uneasy with the growing unity between the tribe and those like me. Suspicion gnawed at the edges of what we'd built. Old fears died hard, and some of the men from the forts began to stir, their eyes sharp with distrust. One afternoon, I found myself standing by the creek, watching the water ripple over smooth stones. The sound was soothing, but my heart beat fast with worry. The line between two worlds was thin, and I feared what might tear it apart. Nico joined me, his gaze distant but steady. "People fear what they don't understand," he said quietly. I nodded. "They see us as enemies, not sisters and brothers." But I believed otherwise. I believed that our strength lay not in hiding from the past, but in facing it together. That evening, around the fire, Chief Takakota gathered the warriors and elders. His voice carried the weight of leadership. "We have been given a chance to build something new," he said, "but it will not come without challenge." He spoke of the settlers' unrest, of the raids on nearby villages, of the fragile truce hanging by a thread. The council decided we needed to send envoys, trusted warriors, and voices of peace to the forts and settlements, to speak for the tribe and for the future we all hoped to build. And so, Ayana, Nico, and I were chosen. Our journey to the settlements was filled with tension. Each step was watched, each word measured, but we pressed on, carrying the hopes of two worlds. In the settlement, faces turned towards us curious, wary, some openly hostile. But we did not flinch. I shared our story, the rescue by the creek, the tribe's honor, the promise of peace. I spoke not as an outsider, but as a daughter of two worlds. Slowly, barriers began to fall. Some settlers offered cautious hands. Others still held tight to fear. That night, as we camped beneath unfamiliar stars, I felt the weight of responsibility settle deep in my chest. This was more than diplomacy. This was a fight for understanding. Days turned into weeks. Our visits sparked conversations, some bitter, others hopeful. I saw children from both worlds playing together. I heard songs merging languages, but danger lurked in the shadows. One evening, a fire broke out in a nearby village, a blaze lit by those who opposed the new peace. The tribe and settlers came together, battling flames side by side. The fire became a symbol not of destruction, but of unity. When the flames died, so did much of the fear. The settlers and tribe saw themselves not as enemies, but as neighbors bound by shared struggle. Returning to the camp, I found a new strength in my bones. The journey was far from over, but we were no longer alone. Chief Takakota greeted us with a quiet pride. He placed his hand over his heart and nodded. "We walk the path of thunder," he said. I understood then that the creek that once divided us had become a river of change, flowing with courage, forgiveness, and hope. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, I knew the story of the orphan girl by the creek was now the story of a bridge built between worlds. I never imagined that a single morning by the creek when I chose to step into the icy water for a stranger would unravel the world I knew and rebuild it into something I never dared dream possible. But here I was, standing at the crossroads of two worlds, carrying the hopes of a people who had embraced me as their own, and a future that belonged to both settlers and tribe alike. The days after the fire in the settlement were charged with fragile hope. Yet beneath that hope simmered tension. Not everyone was ready to let go of old grudges. Not everyone wanted the peace that we fought so hard to build. Whispers of rebellion stirred among some settlers, murmurs of betrayal and distrust. And in the tribe, some elders questioned whether the path we walked was the right one, whether honoring a pale girl from the creek risked the very traditions that had held them together for centuries. The night before the council meeting that would decide the future of our fragile alliance, I sat by the fire with Ayana and Nico. The air was thick with unspoken fears and quiet prayers. I looked at my two closest friends, the warriors of change who had fought beside me, and realized how far we had all come. The next day, the council convened under the ancient oaks that had witnessed countless seasons of war and peace. Chief Takakota's voice was steady and commanding as he spoke of unity, strength, and the shared future we could forge. But then, a group of settlers led by a stern-faced man named Caldwell stepped forward. Their words cut through the air like knives, accusations of betrayal, fear-mongering, and calls to break the treaty. The camp fell silent. The moment felt like the turning point. I rose, my heart pounding, every eye on me. I spoke from the depths of my soul, not just as Emmy Rose, the orphan girl by the creek, but as the daughter of two worlds. I told them about the day I found Ayana broken by the water. How fear had tried to stop me, but kindness pushed me forward. How that simple act had rippled outward, weaving us together in ways none of us expected. I reminded them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to face it. That the creek that once divided our lands could carry us forward, not apart. That we were stronger together. The words hung in the air. Then, slowly, voices began to rise not in anger, but in agreement. Elders who had doubted stepped forward. Settlers who had feared stepped forward. and the rhythm of hope began to beat stronger than the drums of war. But peace demands sacrifice. That night, a sudden storm swept through the valley, a fierce tempest that threatened to undo all we had built. The creek swelled, roaring like a wild beast, flooding the camp and threatening the homes and hearts of everyone there. Without hesitation, the tribe and settlers banded together. We fought the flood not as enemies, but as family. Together, we reinforced levees, saved children trapped in rising waters, and tended to the sick and injured. I remember standing ankle-deep in icy water, gripping a rope that tethered a group of children to safety. Beside me, Ayana shouted orders, her voice strong despite her still healing leg. Nico carried an elderly man to higher ground, his face set with determination. That night, under the clearing sky, the storm finally passed. But it left something behind, a promise. As dawn broke, Chief Takakota gathered the tribe and settlers around the rebuilt fire. He spoke with a voice that carried the weight of generations and the hope of new beginnings. He spoke of the creek as a symbol not of division, but of connection, of how a single act of courage could create ripples that became waves. Then, with solemn ceremony, he placed a hand-carved pendant around my neck, a symbol of our bond, forged from riverstone and decorated with the colors of both our peoples. He declared me not just a daughter of the tribe, but a guardian of the peace we had forged. Tears blurred my vision as the tribe and settlers raised their voices in a song that echoed across the valley. A song of hope, courage, and unity. In that moment, I understood the true meaning of family. Not just those who share your blood, but those who share your heart. Years later, the creek still flows outside my window, but now it sings a different song. A song of laughter from children of both worlds playing on its banks. A song of shared stories woven from many tongues. A song of peace hard won and courage rewarded. And as I look out over the valley, now filled with homes both new and old, I know that the smallest act of kindness, the choice to reach out to a stranger, can change the course of history. Because sometimes, the storm is not the end. It is the beginning. If you were in their shoes, would you fight the same battle? Share your thoughts down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video and explore the other stories waiting for you on the screen.